Basic psychology. Gender bias in psychology. What is gender bias? Did you know that gender bias is a distorted view? That behaviors observed may be typical of both men and women?
No, I wasn't aware of that. Can you give me an example?
Sure, let's look at Milgram's obedience study. It involved only men and found high levels of obedience, with 62% going up to 450-volt shocks.
Assuming the results would be the same for women could be considered gender biased, right?
Exactly. It may be that women could have even higher or lower obedience rates, but we can't assume the results would be the same.
I see. So, what are the different types of gender bias?
One type is androcentrism, where theories and views are based exclusively on a male perspective.
That makes sense, since psychology has been male-dominated for a long time.
Yes, and this male-centered worldview can lead to either alpha bias or beta bias. Alpha bias and beta bias. Alpha bias is when the differences between men and women are exaggerated, resulting in theories that devalue one gender compared to another.
Oh, I see. Can you give me an example of that?
A prime example is Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytical theory, which portrayed women as significantly inferior to men due to the culture of the time.
Wow, that's really interesting. What about beta bias?
Beta bias can occur due to androcentrism, where researchers assume that what's true for men will also be true for women, minimizing the differences between genders.
I can see how that could be problematic. Do you have an example of beta bias?
Yes, the research on the fight-or-flight response is a good example. Researchers often used male animals and assumed the findings would apply to females as well, but that was not the case. Universality. Universality refers to the aim of developing theories that apply to all people, regardless of their differences.
I see. So it's about finding commonalities across different groups of people?
Exactly. But it's not about trying to eradicate differences, like gender differences, as that can lead to bias.
I understand. Can you give me an example of how this bias can occur?
Sure, let's look at Kohlberg's research on moral development. He based his theory on studies with boys and men, assuming it would apply to everyone.
Oh, that's a clear case of beta bias. Assuming the male perspective represents the universal experience.
Precisely. And when Gilligan tested Kohlberg's theory on women, she found they had a different, care-oriented approach to morality.
Wow, that's fascinating. So Kohlberg's original theory was biased, and Gilligan's work helped address that.
Exactly. Gilligan's approach recognized the differences without considering one superior to the other. That's the essence of universality. Evaluating gender bias. Feminist commentators like Judith Worrell have suggested several criteria to help avoid gender bias in research.
What kind of criteria did they suggest?
Well, Worrell suggested that women should be studied within meaningful real-life contexts and participate in research, rather than just being the objects of study.
That makes sense. What else did they suggest?
Worrell also proposed that diversity within groups of women should be examined, rather than just making comparisons between men and women.
Interesting. And what about the research methods?
Feminists have argued that laboratory experiments have been notoriously biased against women. Eakley and Johnson's meta-analysis found that men and women were more alike in terms of leadership style in real-world settings compared to laboratory settings.
Wow, that's really fascinating. So the research methods themselves can be biased?
Exactly. Feminists have also pointed out that equal treatment under the law, while important, can sometimes draw attention away from the special needs of women, like during pregnancy and childbirth.